You're walking through the corridors of Čachtice Castle in 1610, your footsteps echoing against cold stone walls that have witnessed unspeakable horrors. The air is thick with the metallic scent of iron and something else, something that makes your stomach turn. As you round the corner into what was once the castle's main bathing chamber, you freeze in absolute terror at what lies before you. The massive marble tub, carved from a single block of stone, is stained dark red, not from wine or dye, but from something far more sinister. Scattered around the room are instruments of torture that would make the Spanish Inquisition blush with shame. But it's the stories whispered by the trembling servants that truly chill your blood. They speak of a woman so beautiful, so vain, and so utterly consumed by her own reflection that she convinced herself the secret to eternal youth lay not in prayers or potions, but in the warm blood of innocent girls. This woman was no common peasant driven mad by hardship. She was nobility, one of the most powerful figures in all of Hungary, with bloodlines stretching back to kings and emperors. Her name was Elizabeth Báthory, and the horrors she orchestrated within these very walls would earn her a place in history as the most prolific female serial killer of all time. But her story isn't just about murder. It's about how absolute power, combined with narcissistic obsession and medieval superstition, can transform a human being into something far more monstrous than any creature from folklore. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of royal excess or medieval cruelty. This is the story of how beauty became an obsession, how vanity became a religion, and how the pursuit of eternal youth led to the systematic torture and murder of over 600 young women. Elizabeth Báthory didn't just kill, she created an elaborate ritual around death, turning her castle into a temple of blood where she worshipped at the altar of her own reflection. To understand how someone could become such a monster, we need to step back and examine the world that created her. Elizabeth Báthory was born on August 7th, 1560, into the powerful Báthory family of Hungary. This wasn't just any noble family. They were among the most influential dynasties in all of Europe, with connections to royalty across the continent. Her uncle, Stephen Báthory, was king of Poland. Her cousins held positions of power throughout the Holy Roman Empire. The Báthory name carried weight that could topple governments and start wars. But with this power came something darker, a family history steeped in violence, mental instability, and what can only be described as hereditary sadism. The Báthory bloodline was notorious for producing individuals who displayed disturbing psychological traits. Elizabeth's brother was known for his explosive rages and tendency towards sexual violence. Her uncle suffered from what medieval physicians called fits of madness that left him catatonic for weeks at a time. Her aunt was rumored to practice witchcraft and had an unhealthy fascination with torture devices. Growing up in this environment, young Elizabeth learned early that power meant the ability to inflict pain without consequence. The family castle was filled with instruments of torture that were used not just for interrogating prisoners, but for entertainment. Servants who displeased the family would be subjected to elaborate punishments designed more for the amusement of the nobility than for any practical purpose. Elizabeth herself showed signs of disturbing behavior from an early age. At the age of 4, she was discovered by servants torturing small animals in the castle's gardens, not out of curiosity, but with a methodical precision that suggested she was experimenting with different ways to cause maximum suffering. When confronted about this behavior, she didn't show remorse or fear. Instead, she displayed an unsettling calm, as if the screams of dying creatures were simply background music to her daily activities. Her education, typical for noble girls of the era, focused heavily on languages, music, and courtly etiquette. But Elizabeth's tutors noted that she showed an unusual fascination with what they delicately termed anatomical studies. While other children her age were learning to embroider or play the lute, Elizabeth was requesting detailed explanations about human physiology, particularly how blood flowed through the body and what happened when that flow was interrupted. The physical environment of her childhood was equally influential in shaping her twisted psychology. Čachtice Castle, where she would later commit her most heinous crimes, was a fortress designed to intimidate and control. Its thick stone walls blocked out most natural light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual gloom. The dungeons beneath the main structure were equipped with cells designed not just to hold prisoners, but to break their spirits through isolation and sensory deprivation. But perhaps most significantly, the castle contained, quote, what the family euphemistically called the discipline chambers, rooms specifically designed for torture and execution. These weren't crude medieval dungeons, but sophisticated spaces equipped with devices that allowed for precise control over the amount of pain inflicted. Elizabeth spent countless hours in these chambers during her childhood, not as a victim, but as an observer, watching as her family's enemies were systematically broken down through carefully applied suffering. The servants who worked in the castle during Elizabeth's youth left behind accounts that paint a disturbing picture of daily life under the Báthory family's rule. They describe a household where cruelty was not just tolerated but celebrated, where the screams of tortured prisoners were considered no more noteworthy than the sound of rain on the castle walls. Elizabeth's mother, Anna Báthory, was known to bring her daughter to witness executions, treating them as educational experiences that would prepare the girl for her future role as a noble lady with absolute power over her subjects. This systematic exposure to violence had a profound effect on Elizabeth's developing psyche. Child psychologists today understand that repeated exposure to extreme violence during formative years can fundamentally rewire the brain, creating individuals who not only lack empathy, but who actually derive pleasure from the suffering of others. In Elizabeth's case, this neurological damage was compounded by the constant reinforcement that her family's cruelty was not just acceptable but admirable. By the age of 10, Elizabeth had already begun displaying the narcissistic traits that would later drive her to mass murder. She spent hours each day staring at her reflection, not out of typical childhood vanity, but with an intensity that worried even her jaded family members. Servants reported that she would become violently angry if anyone suggested she was anything less than perfectly beautiful, and that she had begun making disturbing comments about her fear of aging. It was during this period that Elizabeth first encountered the superstitions about blood and beauty that would later form the foundation of her killing spree. Medieval Europe was filled with folk beliefs about the magical properties of human blood, particularly the blood of young virgins. These beliefs held that consuming or bathing in such blood could restore youth, cure diseases, and even grant immortality. For a girl already obsessed with her own beauty and terrified of losing it, these superstitions must have seemed like divine revelation. The turning point in Elizabeth's psychological development came when she was 11 years old. During a particularly brutal torture session in the castle's discipline chambers, she witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A young peasant girl, barely older than Elizabeth herself, was being tortured for allegedly stealing bread from the castle's kitchens. As the torturer worked with methodical precision, Elizabeth noticed something that transfixed her: the way the girl's blood seemed to make her skin glow in the torchlight. This observation, filtered through the superstitious beliefs of medieval Europe and the twisted psychology of a child raised on violence, planted the seed of an idea that would eventually blossom into unspeakable horror. Elizabeth became convinced that the secret to maintaining her beauty lay not in cosmetics or prayers, but in the blood of young women like herself. From that moment forward, Elizabeth's behavior became increasingly erratic and cruel. She began experimenting with small animals, not just torturing them for pleasure, but collecting their blood and attempting to use it in primitive beauty treatments. Servants found her chambers filled with bowls of congealed blood, and crude attempts at distilling what she believed were the life-giving properties of the crimson fluid. Her family, rather than being alarmed by this behavior, seemed to view it as evidence of Elizabeth's intelligence and initiative. In their twisted worldview, a child who showed such creativity in pursuing power over life and death was simply displaying the qualities that would make her an effective ruler. They began including her in more serious discussions about family business, treating her not as a child to be protected, but as an apprentice in the art of maintaining power through fear and violence. As Elizabeth approached her teenage years, her obsession with beauty and blood began to merge with the political realities of her position as a member of one of Europe's most powerful families. Marriage negotiations were already underway, with various suitors vying for the privilege of allying themselves with the Báthory name. But Elizabeth had her own ideas about what qualities she wanted in a husband. Not political power or military strength, but someone who would support and enable her increasingly dark fantasies. The young woman who would soon become the Blood Countess was taking shape, molded by a combination of genetic predisposition, environmental factors, and the unique pressures of medieval nobility. Her childhood had taught her that human life was disposable, that beauty was the highest virtue, and that blood held the key to eternal youth. All that remained was for the right circumstances to arise that would allow her to put these twisted beliefs into practice on a scale that would shock even her violence-hardened contemporaries. The stage was set for one of history's most horrific killing sprees, orchestrated by a woman who had been trained from birth to see other human beings as nothing more than resources to be exploited for her own benefit. Elizabeth Báthory's transformation from troubled child to mass murderer was nearly complete, and the innocent girls who would soon fall victim to her obsessions had no idea that their paths were about to cross with one of the most dangerous predators in human history. The marriage that would unleash Elizabeth's full potential for horror was arranged when she was just 14 years old. Her chosen husband was Ferenc Nadasdy, a man whose reputation for battlefield brutality had earned him the nickname the Black Knight. This wasn't a romantic union born of courtly love. It was a calculated political alliance between two of Hungary's most powerful and violent families. But for Elizabeth, it represented something far more significant: the opportunity to find a partner who would not only tolerate her dark inclinations, but actively encourage them. Ferenc was everything the Báthory family could have hoped for in a son-in-law. He was wealthy, politically connected, and possessed a sadistic streak that rivaled Elizabeth's own emerging tendencies. His military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire were legendary not just for their strategic success, but for the creative cruelty he inflicted upon captured enemies. Stories circulated throughout Europe about Ferenc's preferred methods of execution: elaborate tortures that could last for days, designed to extract maximum suffering before finally granting the mercy of death. When Elizabeth first met her future husband, she was reportedly fascinated not by his wealth or status, but by the detailed stories he told about his battlefield exploits. While other noble ladies might have been horrified by accounts of flayed prisoners and mass executions, Elizabeth listened with rapt attention, asking probing questions about techniques and methodology. Ferenc, recognizing a kindred spirit, began sharing increasingly graphic details about his methods, treating their courtship conversations like masterclasses in the art of inflicting pain. Their wedding, held at Vranov Castle in May 1575, was a spectacle that showcased both families' wealth and their shared appreciation for violence as entertainment. The celebration lasted for days with elaborate feasts, musical performances, and what the guests euphemistically called demonstrations. These demonstrations involved the public torture and execution of prisoners, presented as wedding entertainment that would set the tone for the couple's married life. Elizabeth, now 15 and legally bound to one of Europe's most notorious sadists, found herself in an environment where her darkest impulses were not just tolerated, but celebrated. Ferenc recognized his young wife's potential and began what can only be described as her advanced education in the arts of torture and murder. He introduced her to techniques he had learned during his military campaigns, showed her how to use various instruments of torture, and, most crucially, taught her the psychological principles that made victims more compliant and suffering more prolonged. The early years of their marriage were spent at Čachtice Castle, a fortress that Ferenc had specifically modified to accommodate their shared interests. The castle's lower levels were expanded into an elaborate complex of torture chambers, each designed for different types of suffering. There were rooms for physical torture, chambers for psychological torment, and special facilities for what the couple called their experiments. Systematic studies in how much pain the human body could endure before death provided escape. But it was during this period that Elizabeth's obsession with blood and beauty began to evolve from childish superstition into something far more systematic and deadly. Ferenc, impressed by his wife's theories about the life-giving properties of human blood, began providing her with subjects for experimentation. Peasant girls who had been captured during his military campaigns were brought to the castle not as prisoners of war, but as raw materials for Elizabeth's increasingly elaborate beauty treatments. The first documented murder attributed to Elizabeth occurred in 1578, when she was just 18 years old. The victim was a peasant girl named Clara, approximately 14 years of age, who had been brought to the castle to serve as a lady's maid. According to testimony later given by surviving servants, Clara had accidentally pricked Elizabeth with a needle while helping her dress. The sight of her own blood on the girl's hand triggered something primal in Elizabeth's twisted psyche. What happened next would establish the pattern for hundreds of future murders. Elizabeth didn't simply kill Clara in a fit of rage. Instead, she conducted what she later described to Ferenc as an experiment. She had the girl restrained and then made a small incision on her arm, collecting the flowing blood in a silver basin. Elizabeth then used this blood as a face mask, convinced that the young girl's life force would somehow transfer to her own skin and preserve her beauty. The psychological satisfaction Elizabeth derived from this first murder was immediate and overwhelming. Not only had she eliminated someone who had dared to shed her royal blood, but she had also acquired what she believed was a potent beauty treatment. The combination of revenge, power, and vanity created an intoxicating cocktail that would drive her to repeat and refine the process hundreds of times over the following decades. Ferenc's reaction to his wife's first murder was not horror or concern, but rather pride and encouragement. He praised Elizabeth's creativity and suggested ways to improve her technique. This validation from the person whose opinion mattered most to her was crucial in Elizabeth's psychological development. She had found not just a partner who accepted her murderous impulses, but one who actively encouraged their refinement and expansion. Over the next several years, as Ferenc spent increasing amounts of time away on military campaigns, Elizabeth had more opportunities to pursue her deadly hobby without interference. She began developing what modern criminal psychologists would recognize as a sophisticated hunting and killing system. She established networks of procurers who would identify potential victims in surrounding villages, created elaborate cover stories to explain the disappearances, and, most importantly, began refining her methods of extracting and utilizing human blood. The castle's staff during this period consisted largely of individuals who were either too terrified to resist or too corrupted by the promise of rewards to object. Elizabeth surrounded herself with accomplices who shared her twisted worldview, creating an echo chamber where her most depraved impulses were constantly reinforced and validated. These accomplices weren't merely passive witnesses to her crimes. They became active participants in a killing machine that would eventually claim hundreds of lives. But Elizabeth's murders weren't random acts of violence driven by momentary rage or opportunity. They were methodical, systematic, and driven by an increasingly elaborate belief system that combined medieval superstition with her own narcissistic delusions. She became convinced that not all blood was equally valuable for her purposes. The blood of young virgins was most potent, followed by that of girls from noble families, while the blood of peasants and servants was considered barely worthy of collection. This hierarchy of victims led Elizabeth to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of procurement and selection. She began hosting what she called educational opportunities at the castle, inviting the daughters of minor nobility to serve as companions and ladies-in-waiting. These positions were presented as honors that would provide young women with valuable training in courtly etiquette and household management. In reality, they were elaborate traps, designed to provide Elizabeth with a steady supply of high-quality victims, whose disappearances could be more easily explained or covered up. The psychological profile that emerges from studying Elizabeth's methods reveals a killer of extraordinary cunning and cruelty. She understood instinctively how to manipulate the social and economic vulnerabilities of her time period, using the rigid class structure of medieval society to shield herself from investigation while ensuring a constant supply of victims. Parents were honored, that the great Elizabeth Báthory had chosen their daughters for service, never suspecting that they were essentially delivering their children to a predator who viewed them as nothing more than sources of beauty-enhancing blood. As Elizabeth's killing spree intensified, so did her elaborate rituals around the collection and use of human blood. She commissioned specialized equipment from the castle's blacksmiths, devices designed to extract blood from living victims, while keeping them conscious and aware for as long as possible. She developed complex theories about which times of day and seasons of the year produced the most potent blood, leading to carefully scheduled murder sessions that followed astronomical and astrological calculations. The transformation of Čachtice Castle into what was essentially a blood processing facility required the complicity and silence of dozens of individuals. Servants, guards, craftsmen, and suppliers all became part of a conspiracy that enabled Elizabeth's crimes to continue for over 2 decades. Some were motivated by fear, others by greed, and still others by their own twisted fascination with the horrors they witnessed. But all of them understood that their silence was purchased with their lives. Any attempt to expose Elizabeth's activities would result in their own deaths, probably after prolonged torture. By the time Ference died in 1604, Elizabeth had already killed dozens of young women and had refined her methods to a level of efficiency that would have impressed any modern serial killer. But Ference's death removed the last external constraint on her behavior, leaving her free to pursue her obsessions with an intensity that would ultimately lead to her downfall. The widow Báthory, now in complete control of vast estates and answerable to no husband or father, was about to embark on the most prolific killing spree in recorded history. The stage was set for the final, most horrific chapter of Elizabeth Báthory's reign of terror, a period that would see her transform from a dangerous individual killer into the architect of an industrial-scale murder operation that would claim the lives of over 600 young women before finally attracting the attention of authorities powerful enough to stop her. The years following Ference's death in 1604 marked a dramatic escalation in Elizabeth's murderous activities, but they also revealed the sophisticated network of corruption and complicity that had enabled her crimes to flourish for so long. With no husband to answer to and no male relative powerful enough to challenge her authority, Elizabeth found herself in the unprecedented position of wielding absolute power over her vast estates while being consumed by an obsession that had grown beyond all rational bounds. The immediate aftermath of Ference's death presented Elizabeth with both opportunity and challenge. As a widow, she inherited full control of the Nadasdy family's extensive properties, making her one of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in all of Hungary. But widowhood also meant increased scrutiny from relatives, neighbors, and royal officials who had previously deferred to her husband's authority. Elizabeth would need to be more careful, more clever, and more ruthless than ever before if she wanted to continue her blood-soaked pursuit of eternal youth. Her response to this challenge was to transform what had been a personal obsession into something resembling a business operation. Elizabeth began systematically expanding her network of accomplices, recruiting individuals who could help her procure victims, dispose of evidence, and maintain the elaborate facade of respectability that protected her from investigation. She offered generous financial incentives to those willing to participate in her schemes, while making it clear that refusal or betrayal would result in the kind of prolonged death that had become her specialty. The key figures in Elizabeth's expanded operation were a carefully chosen group of servants and associates who shared her complete disregard for human life. There was Doroya Countess, known as Dorka, a peasant woman whose own sadistic tendencies had brought her to Elizabeth's attention years earlier. Dorka specialized in the procurement of victims, using her connections in surrounding villages to identify suitable candidates and create plausible explanations for their eventual disappearances. Then there was Ilona Jo, called Helena, a wet nurse whose maternal appearance made her particularly effective at gaining the trust of young girls and their families. Helena would present herself as a representative of the great Lady Báthory, offering positions of honor and opportunity that parents found impossible to refuse. Her gentle demeanor and convincing stories about the benefits of service at Čachtice Castle made her Elizabeth's most successful recruiter. But perhaps the most crucial member of Elizabeth's inner circle was Katerina Benica, a woman of minor noble birth who had fallen on hard times and found herself dependent on Elizabeth's charity. Katerina's education and social connections made her invaluable in developing cover stories and maintaining correspondence with the families of missing girls. She could craft letters in the victims' handwriting, explaining their contentment with castle life and their decisions to remain in service indefinitely. Together, these women formed what modern law enforcement would recognize as a sophisticated criminal organization, complete with specialized roles, clear hierarchies, and elaborate security measures. They developed coded language for discussing their activities, established secure methods of communication, and created multiple backup plans for dealing with potential investigations. The operation they built around Elizabeth's obsessions was more organized and efficient than many legitimate businesses of the era. The victims Elizabeth targeted during this period fell into distinct categories, each selected according to her increasingly elaborate theories about blood quality and potency. The most prized were young women from minor noble families, girls whose beauty and breeding made their blood particularly valuable in Elizabeth's twisted cosmology, but whose social position was not significant enough to trigger immediate investigations when they vanished. These high-value targets were typically recruited through Elizabeth's finishing school program, a seemingly respectable educational opportunity that attracted daughters of impoverished nobility from across Hungary and neighboring regions. Parents were told their daughters would receive training in languages, music, and courtly etiquette that would prepare them for advantageous marriages. In reality, they were delivering their children to a predator who had refined the art of murder to an almost industrial level of efficiency. The daily routine at Čachtice Castle during this period followed a carefully orchestrated schedule designed to maximize Elizabeth's access to victims while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Mornings were devoted to what Elizabeth called her beauty treatments, sessions that began with the selection of a victim from among the girls currently in residence. These selections were made according to complex criteria that combined astrological calculations, assessments of the victim's physical condition, and Elizabeth's personal preferences regarding facial features and body type. Once a victim was selected, she would be taken to what the castle staff euphemistically called the preparation chambers, specially designed rooms where the actual murders took place. These chambers were marvels of medieval engineering, equipped with sophisticated drainage systems, specialized restraints, and an array of tools designed to extract maximum amounts of blood while prolonging the victim's suffering. Elizabeth had spent years refining the design of these spaces, incorporating lessons learned from each previous murder to improve efficiency and enhance her own psychological satisfaction. The killing process itself had evolved into an elaborate ritual that could last for hours or even days, depending on Elizabeth's mood and the supposed quality of the victim's blood. She had developed multiple methods of extraction, each designed for different purposes and occasions. Some victims were bled slowly through multiple small incisions, allowing Elizabeth to collect their blood gradually while they remained conscious and aware. Others were subjected to more dramatic methods involving specialized devices that could drain a human body completely, while keeping the heart beating for as long as possible. But Elizabeth's obsession extended far beyond the simple collection of blood. She had developed elaborate theories about how different extraction methods affected the potency of the fluid, leading to increasingly creative and horrific experiments. She believed that blood collected from victims who died in terror was more effective for preserving beauty than blood from those who had been given sedatives. She theorized that blood drawn during specific phases of the moon possessed enhanced properties, leading to carefully timed murder sessions that followed astronomical calculations. The use of this collected blood had also evolved into an increasingly complex and ritualized process. Elizabeth's daily beauty routine now involved multiple blood-based treatments, each supposedly designed to address different aspects of aging and physical decay. She would bathe in tubs filled with the blood of young virgins, believing that prolonged immersion would allow her skin to absorb the life force of her victims. She developed facial masks using blood mixed with various herbs and minerals, creating concoctions that she believed could reverse the aging process at a cellular level. More disturbing still were Elizabeth's experiments with consumption of human blood, based on medieval beliefs about the transfer of life force through ingestion. She would drink fresh blood immediately after extraction, convinced that consuming it while still warm would provide maximum benefit. She commissioned specialized vessels for this purpose, ornate goblets and chalices that transformed the act of drinking human blood into something resembling a religious ceremony. The psychological impact of these activities on Elizabeth herself was profound and increasingly visible to those around her. Servants noted that she had developed an almost supernatural obsession with mirrors, spending hours each day examining her reflection for signs of aging. Any perceived flaw or imperfection would send her into rages that could last for days, during which she would order additional murders to obtain fresh blood for emergency beauty treatments. Her behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, swinging between periods of manic energy during which she would orchestrate multiple murders in rapid succession, and dark depressions, where she would lock herself in her chambers for weeks at a time, emerging only to check her appearance in mirrors. The servants learned to read these mood swings carefully, understanding that their own survival depended on anticipating Elizabeth's needs and avoiding anything that might trigger her violent impulses. But perhaps most disturbing was Elizabeth's growing detachment from reality. She began to believe that her blood-based beauty treatments were actually working, that she was successfully halting or even reversing the aging process. This delusion was reinforced by the terrified flattery of her servants, who had learned that agreeing with Elizabeth's self-assessments was essential for survival. The echo chamber of false validation that surrounded her made it increasingly difficult for Elizabeth to assess her actual appearance objectively. Contemporary accounts from visitors to Čachtice Castle during this period paint a disturbing picture of a woman who had lost touch with reality while becoming increasingly skilled at maintaining a facade of normalcy. Foreign dignitaries and neighboring nobles who came to pay their respects to the powerful widow Báthory found her charming, intelligent, and remarkably well-preserved for a woman in her 40s. They had no idea that their hostess was systematically murdering young women in the chambers beneath their feet. The success of Elizabeth's deception was aided by the social and political context of early 17th century Hungary. The country was embroiled in ongoing conflicts with the Ottoman Empire, creating an atmosphere of chaos and instability that made it easier for people to disappear without attracting official attention. Local authorities were overwhelmed with military concerns and had neither the time nor the resources to investigate the disappearance of peasant girls and minor nobles. Moreover, Elizabeth's wealth and political connections provided her with a degree of protection that would have been unimaginable for a less powerful individual. She made strategic donations to the Catholic Church, maintained friendly relationships with key government officials, and used her vast resources to ensure that potential investigators found more profitable pursuits elsewhere. The combination of fear, bribery, and political influence created a shield of immunity that allowed her crimes to continue undetected for years. But this protection came at an enormous cost that extended far beyond the money Elizabeth spent on bribes and donations. The constant stress of maintaining her elaborate deception while feeding an increasingly demanding obsession was taking a severe psychological toll. She began experiencing what modern psychiatrists would recognize as paranoid episodes, becoming convinced that enemies were plotting against her and that rivals were attempting to steal her beauty secrets. These paranoid delusions led Elizabeth to expand her circle of victims to include individuals who had never been part of her original target profile. Servants who had witnessed too much, suppliers who asked too many questions, and even former accomplices who showed signs of wavering loyalty all found themselves added to Elizabeth's growing list of people who needed to be eliminated. The Blood Countess had become a danger not just to innocent young women, but to anyone whose continued existence threatened her carefully constructed world of delusion and murder. By 1609, Elizabeth's operation had reached a scale that even her most devoted accomplices found difficult to comprehend. The castle's lower chambers had been transformed into what could only be described as an abattoir designed for human processing. Multiple torture chambers operated simultaneously, each equipped with its own specialized drainage systems and blood collection apparatus. The sound of screaming had become so commonplace that the remaining servants moved through their daily routines with the mechanical indifference of workers in a slaughterhouse. The sheer logistics of disposing of so many bodies had forced Elizabeth to develop increasingly creative solutions. The castle's grounds were honeycombed with mass graves, carefully concealed beneath gardens and outbuildings. Bodies were often dismembered to make disposal easier, with different parts buried in separate locations to reduce the chances of discovery. Some remains were fed to the castle's pigs, while others were burned in specially constructed furnaces that operated throughout the night, sending plumes of greasy black smoke into the Hungarian countryside. But Elizabeth's growing carelessness was beginning to attract unwanted attention. The disappearance of so many young women from the surrounding region had not gone completely unnoticed, despite her elaborate cover stories and bribes to local officials. Families were asking increasingly persistent questions about daughters who had supposedly found wonderful positions at the great castle but had mysteriously stopped sending letters home. Village priests were receiving confessions from individuals who claimed to have witnessed strange activities at Čachtice, though most were too terrified to provide specific details. The turning point came when Elizabeth made the fatal error of expanding her victim pool to include young women from prominent noble families. Girls whose disappearances could not be explained away with simple stories about voluntary service or tragic accidents. These high-profile victims brought with them connections to powerful relatives who possessed both the resources and the political influence necessary to demand real investigations. The first serious challenge to Elizabeth's immunity came from the family of Anna Darvulia, a young noblewoman who had vanished while supposedly attending one of Elizabeth's educational programs. Anna's father, a wealthy landowner with connections to the royal court, refused to accept the usual explanations about his daughter's contentment with castle life. When weeks passed without any direct communication from Anna, he began making inquiries that could not be dismissed or diverted through the usual channels. Desperate to maintain her facade, Elizabeth ordered her accomplices to produce evidence that Anna was still alive and well. This led to an increasingly elaborate deception involving forged letters, false witnesses, and even an attempt to find a girl who resembled Anna closely enough to appear at public functions in her place. But these desperate measures only drew more attention to the inconsistencies in Elizabeth's stories and raised additional questions about the fate of other missing girls. The investigation that followed was led by György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, and one of the few officials in the kingdom with sufficient authority to challenge Elizabeth's power. Thurzó had initially been reluctant to pursue the matter, partly due to his own family's financial dealings with the Báthory estate, but the mounting evidence of systematic murder eventually made official action unavoidable. On December 29, 1610, Thurzó arrived at Čachtice Castle with a contingent of soldiers and court officials, ostensibly for a routine inspection, but actually to gather evidence of Elizabeth's crimes. What they found exceeded even their worst expectations. The castle reeked of death and decay, with bloodstains visible throughout the main living areas and torture devices openly displayed in what had once been formal reception rooms. In the dungeons beneath the castle, the investigators discovered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Dozens of girls were found in various stages of torture and mutilation, some still alive but barely recognizable as human beings. The walls were stained with blood and decorated with implements of torture that demonstrated a level of creative cruelty that shocked even experienced military officers. Bodies in various states of decomposition were stacked like cordwood in storage chambers, while specialized equipment for blood collection and processing filled room after room. Elizabeth herself was found in her private chambers, apparently in the middle of one of her elaborate beauty treatments. She was covered in blood from head to toe, sitting before a massive mirror while two terrified servant girls applied fresh human blood to her face and hair. Her appearance was so grotesque that several of the investigating officers initially mistook her for one of the victims, unable to reconcile the blood-soaked creature before them with their expectations of noble dignity. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's capture was marked by desperate attempts to minimize the scandal and protect the reputation of Hungary's noble families. Many of Elizabeth's crimes had been committed with the knowledge or participation of other aristocrats, creating a web of complicity that extended far beyond the walls of Čachtice Castle. Thurzo and his investigators found themselves in the delicate position of needing to prosecute obvious crimes while avoiding revelations that might destabilize the entire social order. The solution they arrived at was a carefully orchestrated cover-up that acknowledged Elizabeth's guilt while limiting the scope of public disclosure. Her accomplices were arrested and subjected to public trials that revealed enough details to satisfy demands for justice while carefully avoiding the most damaging revelations about noble complicity. Dorca, Helena, and several other key participants were executed in gruesome public spectacles designed to demonstrate that justice had been served. Elizabeth herself presented a more complex problem. As a member of one of Hungary's most powerful families, she could not be subjected to public trial without risking political upheaval that might benefit the kingdom's enemies. The Ottoman Empire remained a constant threat, and internal conflicts over Elizabeth's crimes could provide opportunities for foreign intervention that Hungary could ill afford. The compromise reached by the authorities was to confine Elizabeth to her own castle under conditions that amounted to solitary imprisonment for life. She was walled up in a set of rooms in Čachtice Castle's tower, with only small openings for the delivery of food and the removal of waste. This solution satisfied the demands for punishment, while avoiding the political complications that would have resulted from a public execution. For Elizabeth, this confinement represented the ultimate irony. The woman who had murdered hundreds of young girls in pursuit of eternal beauty found herself trapped in a tomb-like existence where mirrors were forbidden, and human contact was limited to the brief moments when food was delivered through a slot in the wall. She would spend the next 4 years in this living death, slowly going mad as she was forced to confront the reality of what she had become, without the distractions of murder and blood-soaked beauty treatments. The final years of Elizabeth Báthory's life were marked by a gradual descent into complete madness, as the full weight of her isolation and the futility of her crimes finally penetrated her delusional worldview. Servants who delivered her meals reported that she spent most of her time talking to herself, sometimes carrying on elaborate conversations with imaginary visitors or long-dead victims. She would scream for hours at a time, demanding mirrors and beauty treatments that would never come again. Her physical deterioration was swift and dramatic. Without access to her blood-based beauty regimens, Elizabeth aged rapidly, developing the wrinkles and gray hair she had spent decades trying to prevent. The irony was not lost on those few individuals who were aware of her condition. The woman who had killed hundreds in pursuit of eternal youth was experiencing the very aging process she had fought so desperately to avoid. On August 21st, 1614, Elizabeth Báthory was found dead in her cell, apparently having died in her sleep. She was 54 years old, an age that would have been considered relatively advanced for her era, but nowhere near the immortality she had sought through her horrific crimes. Her body showed all the signs of natural aging that she had tried so desperately to prevent: wrinkled skin, gray hair, and the general physical decay that comes to all mortals, regardless of how much innocent blood they spill in pursuit of youth. The death of Elizabeth Báthory marked the end of one of history's most systematic and prolonged killing sprees, but it did not end the impact of her crimes on the survivors and the broader community. The families of her victims continued to suffer for generations, carrying the trauma of their losses and the knowledge that their daughters had died in unimaginable agony to feed one woman's narcissistic delusions. The legacy of the Blood Countess extends far beyond the immediate horror of her crimes to encompass broader questions about power, accountability, and the corrupting influence of absolute authority. Elizabeth's ability to murder hundreds of innocent people while maintaining her position in society demonstrates the dangerous combination of wealth, social status, and political connections that can shield even the most obvious monsters from consequences. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who hide behind facades of respectability and social prominence. The same noble bearing and cultured demeanor that allowed Elizabeth to attract victims also protected her from investigation for decades, creating a perfect storm of circumstances that enabled unprecedented evil to flourish unchecked. Today, the ruins of Čachtice Castle still stand in what is now Slovakia, a crumbling monument to one of history's most horrific examples of unchecked power and twisted obsession. Visitors to the site often report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and sadness, as if the stones themselves remember the screams of the innocent girls who died within those walls. The castle's dungeons, where so much suffering took place, remain sealed and inaccessible, though local legends claim that the stains of blood can still be seen on the walls despite centuries of weathering. The story of Elizabeth Báthory reminds us that evil often wears the mask of beauty and respectability, that monsters can hide behind noble titles and elegant manners. Her crimes were not the result of sudden madness or desperate circumstances, but of a systematic corruption that began in childhood and grew over decades into something that defied human comprehension. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that Elizabeth's story is not entirely unique. Throughout history, powerful individuals have used their positions to prey upon the vulnerable, hiding their crimes behind walls of wealth and influence. The Blood Countess may have been the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history, but she was not the only person to discover that absolute power can corrupt absolutely, transforming human beings into creatures far more monstrous than any mythological beast. In the end, Elizabeth Báthory's pursuit of eternal beauty led only to eternal infamy, her name forever associated with the worst impulses of human nature. The blood she spilled in pursuit of youth could not prevent her own aging and death, and the terror she inflicted on hundreds of innocent victims serves as a permanent reminder of the price that societies pay when they allow power to exist without accountability or moral restraint.